What makes a good fantasy sword?
First, we have to define what good means.
Does good mean realistic?
Does good mean it's impactful to the story or the characters?
Or does good mean that it fits well within the world?
Depending on the setting, it'll be a mix of these things.
So let's take a look at the setting and how that impacts the swords. In the gritty and realistic world of The Witcher, a giant anime sword wouldn't really make a lot of sense.
The Witcher takes place in a semi-historically accurate setting. While there are fantasy elements like magic and monsters, things tend to be generally pretty realistic.
The world of The Witcher is heavily influenced by history and reality, from the weapons and armor that they use, from the architecture that you see. Putting in giant fantasy weapons like this would kind of break that immersion.
Most of the people in The Witcher still have human-like abilities.
Even The Witcher, who has enhanced strength and speed, isn't shown to be leagues stronger than other people. He gets killed by, spoilers, a guy with a pitchfork. So it wouldn't make sense for him to have a giant weapon.
In the wackier world of anime, it makes sense to have giant, ridiculous swords because everything is over the top.
When you have characters slicing through buildings or battling giant Lovecraftian monsters, it makes sense for them to have ridiculous weapons. This is why we don't bat an eye at Guts' sword from Berserk or a FromSoft character wielding a giant piece of masonry. In a more realistic setting like The Witcher, Game of Thrones, or Lord of the Rings, it makes sense for the characters to have more realistic swords.
The characters are mostly human, battling humanoid enemies, so a good fantasy sword makes sense in the setting.
And it also says something about the character. A great example of swords showing character are the swords from Bleach.
They all start with some variation of a standard katana, and they're all pretty practical.
But when they unlock their secondary form, things get crazy. Sometimes the swords break the laws of physics, and you might be tempted to say that makes it a bad sword, but it's not, because it says something about the character of the person using it.
A great example is Kenpachi, who doesn't even get a Bankai until way later in the show because he's so powerful he doesn't need one. And when he does, it's a gigantic axe that can cut through anything, showing his power.
The narrative device of the sword's progression within Bleach gives us more options to highlight character differences. For instance, all of the swords start off small and then get bigger with their first transformation.
Except for the main character, Ichigo. Unlike everybody else who starts off with a fairly realistic katana, he has a massive oversized one.
This is to show how powerful he is. His first form is gigantic because it can't contain his spirit power. But as he unlocks further stages, it gets smaller and more reasonable, showing that he has more control over his power.
But what about a world where everybody has normal swords?
In a more realistic setting, you can highlight a character as being special by giving them an unrealistic weapon.
Some of the most iconic examples of this is with Guts in Berserk or Asta in Black Clover.
In Berserk, Griffith and all of the other characters have more reasonable weapons, but Guts uses a giant slab of iron. It's too heavy and impractical for anybody else to wield, but he's so strong that he can, and this sets him apart.
In that same vein, in Black Clover, Yami, the only other character who really uses a sword, just has a standard katana. Asta is the only one with a massive sword, showing how strong and ripped he is.
You don't need to have a giant sword to tell the audience something about a character. In The Witcher, Geralt has two swords, a silver sword for monsters and a steel sword for humans, and this sets him apart. Oftentimes, NPCs will comment on this. They know that he is a Witcher because he carries two swords, and you can feel the fear and hatred they have for him and all Witchers. He is a freak, a mutant, and a pariah, but he's also someone who is necessary to their society, doing jobs that they can't do.
You can see the same thing in Sword Art Online. Everybody in that world can only use one sword, except for Kirito. He gets two swords, because he's special.
The last thing we're going to talk about is realism. Swords don't necessarily have to be realistic to be good, but you are constrained by the medium you're working in.
In video games and animation and writing, you can get away with whatever you want because you're not bound by the laws of physics.
When you're actually filming something with real actors, generally you have to have a prop that's usable. CGI can help a lot with this, but it still kind of looks clunky if you don't have something your actor can wield.
That's why a lot of swords in movies and TV look like normal swords, because a real person has to use them.
Even fantasy weapons like lightsabers need to have a physical prop for actors to actually use, and because of that, they function a lot like normal swords.
So there's no right way to make a fantasy sword.
As long as it fits the setting, says something about the character, and is possible within the medium,
sky's the limit.
Hey guys, thanks for watching. These videos are made possible by support from our viewers. If you'd like to help out the channel, please consider checking out our Patreon, our YouTube memberships, and donating as low as $1 a month. It really does help.